coba untuk translate ini. Oke, kita tunggu sekitar 2 menit lagi. Setelah itu kita akan mulai kelas atau interview ini. Oke, itu already streamed on YouTube. Okay. I think it's great to start it right now. Before we start the discussions or the interview today, I want to introduce Prof. Oppy, Prof. Graham Oppy from Monash University. Thank you, Prof. Oppy, for your willingness to come here to talk for the Indonesian audience.
Hi, hello everyone.
Yeah, so I'll speak in Indonesia first. I'll introduce you in bahasa Indonesia. Jadi teman-teman, Prof. Oppy ini adalah seorang filsuf ya, asalnya dari Australia, dan seperti yang kalian tahu, beliau itu fokus daripada penelitian atau pemikiran itu di dalam bidang filsafat agama. Ya, ada banyak buku-buku yang ia tulis dengan topik-topik ateisme. Yang paling sedikit saya udah pernah sebut Atheism, Basic Introductions. Ada juga Philosophy and Atheism. Ada juga argument against God atau argumen lawan Tuhan, arguments about God atau argumen mengenai Tuhan. Dan Prof. Oppy ini membahas setiap argumen-argumen, mengkritisinya, mempertanyakannya, dan juga memberikan banyak-banyak insights di dalam tulisan-tulisannya. Okay, so Prof. Oppy, thank you again for coming here. Maybe, you write a lot of books on atheism, and your Atheism, the basic introductions from Routledge, argument against God, argument against about God, and many books you write about atheism. Are there anything that you need to introduce, Prof. Oppy, by yourself?
I'm not sure what to add to the introduction that you've made. So I think lots of my books are really about philosophy of religion and about religion rather than just about atheism. So, you know, most of my teaching is about philosophy of religion.
Yeah. Okay. I'll start the interview. Can I ask? I'll start with the first questions, Prof. Oppy. Okay. Okay. So let's start the interview. Before we discuss atheism, Prof. Oppy, we always first our interview is to talk or to share what they think about philosophy. What philosophy is for you, and how could you be first introduced to philosophy? Also, why do you choose to indulge in academic philosophy? Can you share a bit about your background?
Okay, so on the first thing about what philosophy is, I think of the philosophical questions as all the questions where there isn't currently expert agreement on the answers to those questions, and there isn't currently expert agreement about how we should go about trying to find answers to those questions. So I think of philosophy as something that happens around the edges of every domain of inquiry. So, you know, if you think of something where there's expert agreement about a lot of central stuff, say physics, around the kind of core of stuff in physics that the expert agree on, there's stuff where the experts don't currently agree, but they're all it's sort of current research and they agree what the methods are. And then you move out a bit further and you get to things where nobody's really quite sure whether the questions are going to be answerable by physics or not. And at that point, you're kind of crossing over into the philosophy of physics. And I think every discipline has that structure. There are whole areas that are just kind of philosophical. I think most of the stuff about normative questions, so questions about morality and some other normative domains, are still entirely philosophical. We haven't really made much progress on working out how to bring ourselves to agreement on questions about what's right and wrong, for example. So that's my view about what philosophy is. As for how I became a philosopher, I've been interested in philosophy since I was a teenager. So when I was at school, one of the things that I thought I might like to end up doing with my life was to become a philosopher. And there were other things that I might have done, but that's the way that it ended up.
I see. So philosophy mostly talk about the normative things like what is good or is it bad? Yeah. Could we explain those kind of things through science, or should we use it through philosophical inquiry? I mean, like, can science explain normative things?
So I suspect that there's kind of there's normative, whatever the explanation is of the normative things that we say and the normative things that we believe and so on, it's unlikely that it's going to be reducible to descriptions that are given by the sciences. To the extent that the sciences are supposed to be descriptive rather than normative, they're not going to end up explaining normative stuff. So this is just kind of an old point that Hume, amongst other people, made long ago, right, about not being able to reduce the normative to the descriptive, not being able to get the normative from the descriptive. So I'm not expecting that there'll be a reduction there.
Okay. I want to follow up the second questions. Do you still remember that? What is the first philosophical book that you ever read?
So what got me interested in philosophy in the first place was a book that's partly philosophical. So when I can't remember now if it was my 15th or my 16th birthday, but I was given a copy of Bertrand Russell's autobiography. And Russell's autobiography has a certain amount of philosophy in it. And I was really taken by his character and his life, but also his descriptions about what it was like to do philosophy in that book. And so that was really where I got started.
Okay. Please let me translate first to the audiences. Jadi teman-teman, apa sih filsafat buat Prof. Oppy? Buat Prof. Oppy, filsafat itu sebenarnya satu pendekatan, ya, second order gitu ya, ke dalam ilmu-ilmu, ke dalam sains-sains apapun. Dan yang kedua, filsafat itu sampai sekarang masih diperlukan. Kenapa? Karena ada banyak pertanyaan-pertanyaan normatif yang tidak bisa dijawab oleh misalnya sains. Sains itu hanya mendeskripsikan, tetapi tidak bisa memberikan suatu tatanan gitu ya. Ya, David Hume misalnya, David Hume ngomong yang deskripsi itu bukan berarti off atau harus. Itu yang pertama. Yang kedua, Prof. Oppy dari dulu udah tertarik banget sama filsafat. Dia nggak terlalu ingat, ya, tapi buku Bertrand Russell adalah salah satu buku yang membuat dia pada akhirnya tertarik untuk belajar filsafat. Nah, mungkin kalian boleh tuh mulai cari-cari dari biografi dulu justru Prof. Oppy ini. Okay, thank you, Prof. Oppy. I'll give the second question. Maybe this is a bit like a personal question, but I wonder, were you atheist in your childhood? I mean, like, are there any time that you were an atheist, someone who believes in God? And have you ever had any maybe spiritual experiences? And if it is yes, how and why did you turn to atheism?
Okay, so my family history is Australian Methodist. So my parents were both Methodists, and there's a history going back centuries of, I mean, it can't go back too far because it can't go back before the Wesleys, but it goes back in England to the 18th century, the history of Methodism in my family. So I was raised a Methodist and had kind of fairly standard religious beliefs for a child, I think, although maybe I took it a bit more seriously than some children. And then when I was about 13, I started thinking about it and quickly came around to the realization that I actually didn't believe the things that I'd been taught in Sunday school and church, and I stopped believing and have never gone back. And I've never had religious experiences of any kind.
So are there any like maybe intellectual doubts that that overwhelm you when you started to okay, here we go, I'm atheist right now because there is no intellectual argument for yeah, uh, the church is, I mean, like yeah, it couldn't satisfy my curiosity, maybe like that.
So I don't really remember how the transition from theism to atheism happened. I thought about a bunch of things, but not for very long. And just it was sort of like a discovery that I just didn't think the world was like that. It seemed to me that the kind of natural position for me to take was that the natural universe is all there is, really. All there is, at least causally. I mean, at that stage, I wasn't thinking about questions like whether they're abstract objects or questions like that. But putting those kinds of things to one side, you could say that I came around to the view that the causal order is just the natural order, the order that's described by the natural sciences and the human sciences and the kind of secular humanities and so on.
I see. Okay. Please let me translate it, Prof. Oppy. Jadi teman-teman, Prof. Oppy pernah menjadi seorang teis gitu ya. Bahkan waktu kecil dia ini dididik sebagai metodis ya, atau salah satu agama ya, atau salah satu apa namanya tuh, aliran di dalam kekristenan. Tapi ada satu poin atau satu titik di mana di umur 12 tahun dia mulai mempertanyakan gitu. Tapi dia nggak ingat nih satu posisi atau satu saat khusus di mana dia mulai mempertanyakan. Tapi yang dia ingat intinya ya, ada satu saat di mana dia percaya bahwa kayaknya yang ada itu cuma alam semesta, tidak ada yang namanya objek yang abstrak, apalagi yang namanya Tuhan. Gitu. Jadi saat itulah di mana Prof. Oppy ini mulai jadi ateis, gitu. Kalau bisa dibilang, saya bilang bisa seperti itu, gitu. Jadi menarik gitu ya. Dia nggak ingat waktu transisi pasnya, tapi dia tahu bahwa ada satu titik di mana dia berhenti untuk mempercayai keberadaan Tuhan, gitu. Dan lagi pula memang sebagian besar dari kita kan masa kecilnya pasti pernah kepapar sama ya, keagamaan, itu kata dia. Jadi itu. Okay, I'll continue the next questions. Okay, so before you write and talk a lot of things on philosophy of religion, especially on atheism, I think you wrote also in philosophy of language. What makes you then turn your interest toward philosophy of religion and especially atheism? Are there any reasons?
So, I mean, in a way, I'd always been interested in philosophy of religion, but as it happened during my undergraduate and graduate training, I did almost no philosophy of religion. I did one undergraduate unit in philosophy of religion in my undergraduate degree, and there was nothing in my graduate studies about philosophy of religion. So I came out with my PhD in philosophy of language, which I did in the United States, and came back to Australia. And I looked like I was going to be unemployed. And I was in Canberra at the time, and the Dean of the Faculty of Arts needed someone to teach a course in philosophy of religion. And he asked me whether I could do it. And so I said yes. And then I had to teach myself philosophy of religion so that I could teach it. So for that semester, I was always about just 1 week ahead of the students as I was reading all the stuff for that I was going to talk about the next week. But over the course of that semester, I learned enough about philosophy of religion that I was able to write some journal articles that got published. And then sort of on just on impulse, I applied for a grant to write a book in philosophy of religion. So the grant scheme that I applied to, the ARC scheme, was new, and nobody really knew that much about it. And the sort of senior philosophers who were my mentors said there's no way that they were going to be funding philosophers out of this scheme. But I applied for a postdoc which I got. So I went to the Australian National University for 3 years, and that's where I wrote my book on ontological arguments. And by the time I'd finished doing that, I'd started to kind of make a career in philosophy of religion, and I'd sort of transitioned out of philosophy of language. So it was a series of accidents, really. I could easily have ended up just being someone who worked in philosophy of language and philosophy of mind.
I see. Okay. Okay. So it sounds practical. I mean, the reason why you turned to the philosophy of religion.
So I think of it as just, you know, things could easily have gone differently. Right? It's just almost a matter of luck that that's where I ended up. If I hadn't got the grant from the ARC, I may well have not turned my hand to philosophy of religion at all. And I didn't put a lot of thought into the grant application. I was told there's, my wife saw this advertisement in the newspaper for the scheme and said, why don't you apply for it? And so I did. I sat down one afternoon and I wrote the application. I rang up Frank Jackson at the ANU and I said, you know, is it okay if I apply? And he said, sure, you won't get the grant, but go ahead, right? And then, so it's just highly contingent.
And now here it is. Yeah, we have one of the, I mean, the most, one of the famous philosopher of religion right now. Okay, please let me translate it, Prof. Oppy. Jadi teman-teman, menarik banget ya. Prof. Oppy itu kenal filsafat agama atau pergi ke sana. Jadi dia dulu filsafat bahasa, tapi ke filsafat agama karena dia dapat hibah dana gitu. Jadi karena hibah dana, akhirnya dia ya itu yang nguntungin tanda kutip buat dia pergi ke sana filsafat agama. Ya terus sekarang jadi fokusnya ya cuma filsafat agama kebanyakan. Ya jadi lebih agak kecelakaan gitu ya untuk datang ke filsafat agama. Oh ya, anyway, teman-teman silahkan bertanya, ngomong apapun di chat gitu ya. Tapi tolong jangan nyalain kamera. Jadi tolong tulis apapun aja. Kalau ada pertanyaan langsung chat. Dan sekarang ini kita akan masuk ke dalam topik ateismenya. Okay, Prof. Oppy, we have talked some backgrounds about you. Now let's go turn into the topic that we want to bring up here about atheism. The first questions about atheism, maybe it's a bit definition. It's questions about definition. Some philosophers or thinkers consider atheism as a lack of knowledge of God, or even, citing Dawkins, everyone is an atheist for other religious believers who believe a different concept of God. What is your response? I mean, do you agree, or do you have your own definition of atheism?
So that way of talking about atheism seems strange to me, but you're, for particular purposes, you're free to define words however you like. So, you know, if Dawkins wants to use the word that way, he can. What really matters is the concepts that we want to pick out with our words. And I prefer to use the words differently. So for me, an atheist is someone who says there are no gods. God doesn't exist and there are no gods. And a theist is somebody who says God exists, or at least there are gods, right? Because theists could be polytheists as well as monotheists. An agnostic is somebody who says, I'm undecided about whether there are gods or not. And there is another category, though they don't have an opinion. They're the people who've, for whatever reason, have never considered whether there are gods or not. I call them innocents. I think of sort of 2-week-old babies and chimpanzees and people in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's. There's various classes of people who are innocents because they, as philosophers might say, they don't have the concept of God, so they can't have an opinion about whether God exists. Right. So that's how I would use the terms. And what I'm interested in is, in my writings, is the people who say there are no gods, right? And if people want to use the word atheism differently, then we could pick a different word, or you can just remember that that's how I use the word.
I see. So right now you consider yourself an atheist and not an agnostic.
So I've kind of gone sort of a bit like Bertrand Russell, There was a time when I called myself an agnostic, but that was only because I was setting the standards for belief very, very high. So Russell regularly called himself an agnostic, but he also admitted that the sense in which he was an agnostic about the existence of God, he was also an agnostic about the existence of Julius Caesar, right? So which is a kind of weird thing to say, because most of us are, almost certain that Caesar existed, and Russell himself was almost certain that there are no gods and that God doesn't exist. And the way that my use of the terms went, it just followed Russell's, except that I came to think that's a silly way of using the terms, right? So long as you're a bit inclined towards the view that there are no gods, that means you're an atheist, just of a fairly weak kind, because your considered view is that there aren't any gods, but sort of, your credence is 60% or something.
Oke, I'll translate. Jadi teman-teman, Prof. Oppy ini tadi mendefinisikan apa sih ateisme itu, apa sih agnostisisme. Jadi kalau kita ngelihat gitu ya, bagi sebagian orang yang namanya ateis itu cuma adalah orang-orang yang nggak punya lack of knowledge gitu. Jadi mereka cuma kurang pengetahuan akan Tuhan, ya. Atau kalau bilang Dawkins ngomong, semua orang tuh ateis, ya. Nggak ada yang tidak ateis, paling nggak dalam konsep Tuhan yang lain. Nah, buat Prof. Oppy, salah gitu ya. Jadi ateis itu sederhana, artinya dia itu nggak percaya akan yang namanya keberadaan Tuhan. Jadi cukup sederhana ya. Jadi ateis adalah orang yang tidak percaya keberadaan Tuhan. Ya, nggak perlu bilang lack of knowledge of God, nggak perlu bilang semua orang itu ateis, nggak. Ateis adalah orang-orang yang tidak percaya akan keberadaan Tuhan. Nah, ada ateis, ada agnostik. Agnostik itu punya punya keraguan-raguan, gitu. Tapi nggak sepenuh atau sekuat ateis. Nah, Prof. Oppy ini tadinya seorang agnostik, gitu ya. Tapi mulai perlahan-lahan seperti Bertrand Russell, dia mengalami pergeseran gitu ya, dari agnostik menjadi ateis yang sebenarnya percaya, oh nggak ada nih yang namanya Tuhan. Nah, kira-kira kenapa ya buat Prof. Oppy nggak ada yang namanya Tuhan? Nah, ayo kita lanjut ke pertanyaan selanjutnya. Oke, Prof. Oppy, atheist state that we see that recently there are I could say there are more atheists than there are many atheists compared to some centuries behind. Yeah, there's a progress for people who say that they are non-religious, they are secular, or they are atheists. Is atheism a recent phenomenon that happens in our modern era, like in 20th century, since the twilight of the modern science? Or are there any historical figures which happen to be an atheist even before the Common Era or the CE?
So there's the evidence about this is kind of a bit all over the place. So in ancient India, say 600 BC, there were Chavakas, and they were definitely atheists and materialists and consequentialists, and they had a lot of the sensibilities of many modern atheists. What we know about them, we may know mainly from their opponents, because their writings didn't survive, but there are some writings that quote them and that in various ways make fun of them, which makes it seem clear that the people who are writing this stuff did really feel threatened by them. Okay, so that's India. In the ancient, sort of around the ancient Mediterranean, there's no clear evidence, sort of no conclusive proof that there were people who said there are no gods. There were people who made fun of popular belief about the gods and various other things along those lines, but there isn't really a proof. I think that given that there were the Chavakas in India, there are bound to have been atheists in the ancient Mediterranean as well, but that's just a conjecture. I also think that right through in Europe from the time that Christianity spread, at least through Northern Europe, that amongst the common people, there would have been atheists. It's just that they wouldn't have advertised the fact to anybody because it would have been dangerous to them. And because they were kind of ordinary people, they didn't leave any records. Again, that's just a conjecture. I'd really like to do more research on this, but I've got no idea how to research it. And I suspect that the records just aren't there. So I guess to kind of sum up this bit of it, we don't know. We don't know much at all about the record of atheism in earlier times. We do know that there were atheists in India, right, a lot, way back. So it's a reasonable speculation that there were atheists elsewhere as well, but we don't know. Since a rough sort of point, I guess, for Europe, for northwestern Europe, from about 1730 or thereabouts, there's been a kind of gradual rise in the number of atheists. I mean, a kind of ongoing thing. It was slow, and we don't really know how much the numbers have risen recently. And the sort of data that we've got from, say, national censuses in countries like Australia and the UK and America is that non-belief is on the rise. But given what I said earlier, there's a big difference between just not having beliefs and positively believing that there are no gods. And governments don't collect data about atheists, in my sense. So it's not really all that clear how much the number of atheists has been going up either, because there just isn't the collection of that kind of data. Another thing I could say, there are sorry, I'll turn my phone off. There are big international surveys that are done, but the questions that they ask on the whole don't distinguish between people who believe that there are no gods and people who haven't made their mind up about whether there are gods, and so on. And so those surveys are not reliable either. So I want to be a bit cautious about the answer to the question. And I think what's true is, at least in the West, in those kind of prosperous parts of the West, is that there's been a decline in religious belief, in particular of people signing up to say that they belong to a particular organised religion. But that's quite different from there being a growth in the number of atheists or the percentage of atheists in the sense in which I'm interested in atheism.
Okay, yeah, it's very good. Thank you for the clarifications. Yeah, so we couldn't say that there's really a rise on atheism, if I'm not wrong, isn't it?
So I suspect that there's some increase in numbers, but we just don't have sufficiently. I don't think that we have the figures to absolutely back up that claim. I think if you look at a country like Australia and you look at the census data in the year 1900, where 97+% of people say that they're Christian, and you look in when was the last census? I forget, 2015 or whenever the last census was. And you find out that about half of the population isn't religious. It's a reasonable guess that the number of atheists has gone up a bit, but how much, can you quantify it? I'm kind of skeptical about that.
Sure. Okay, maybe I want to follow up the questions. Do you think the rise of atheism is caused because the twilight of modern science? I mean, like, there's a cause and effect because there's science, therefore there's many atheists out there. What do you think about that?
I don't think that there's any direct connection between the rise of science and the rise of atheism. And I'm very interested in the question about why atheism appeared in Europe in the early 18th century. And I think there were a lot of factors that contributed, and I'm not really inclined to think that science was among the most important of them. If you look at the history, European history, say from the year 1000 coming forwards, and you think about big events that happened that helped to make it possible by 1770 for people in England and France to say, I'm an atheist, and not expect to get put to death for doing it, right? There's a lot's changed over a very long, and I think the time frame is quite long. Things that made a difference. One was the Reformation, right? Instead of having one church, you had a fragmentation of the Christian churches in Europe, and that created all kinds of openings for questioning of authority. So that was one important step. There's a lot of sort of to and fro political power, whether political power rests with kings or whether it rests with the nobility. And the sort of ebbs and flows of political power made a difference to the kind of political authority of the churches as well, in a way that also eventually helped to enable atheism to become a kind of publicly acceptable thing. One of the biggest factors is corruption of the church, or perceived corruption of the church amongst people who rebelled against the church, right? That feeds into the Reformation, but it feeds into a whole lot of other things. So people, sects that rebelled against the church, and the church responded by typically by wiping them out. That didn't help to build the kind of moral credentials of the church. And so that was another thing that led to some turning of the tide of popular opinion that made atheism become a kind of publicly acceptable option. There's a dozen other things I could add, right? So the point here is just that there are lots of factors, and perhaps the rise of science plays some role, but I don't think it's particularly, it's one of the biggest factors.
I'll translate it. Oke, jadi teman-teman menarik banget perbincangan ini. Jadi tadi saya nanya gitu ya. Jadi sejak kapan sih ateis itu aja? Apakah benar karena kebetulan sains maka jadi ada ateis? Nah, tapi kita bisa tarik ini belakang jauh banget ya, dari tahun 600 sebelum Masehi. Secara khusus merujuk ke kelompok yang namanya Kifakra ya kalau nggak salah ya. Nanti saya pastikan lagi, itu di India. Mereka itu ada kemungkinan punya satu konsep yang cukup ateistik, paling nggak materialistik ya. Jadi mereka nggak percaya sama hal-hal yang supranatural gitu. Ada juga kemungkinan besar bahkan sejak penyebaran zaman kekristenan ke Eropa Utara, orang-orang Eropa Utara itu nggak percaya sama kekristenan atau teisme, tapi mereka ya takut lah ya, maksudnya nggak berani untuk state itu ke orang-orang gitu. Jadi menarik banget ya. Dan tadi saya juga nanya, apakah benar sains itu menyebabkan teisme? Dan jawabannya kaget gitu saya, enggak ya. Jadi yang namanya ateisme itu tidak datang semata-mata karena sains, tapi ada banyak faktor yang menyebabkan ateisme muncul. Bahkan menariknya salah satunya justru adalah reformasi di abad ke-16 oleh Martin Luther. Itu yang menyebabkan gereja mulai tersebar dan nggak lagi yang namanya kekuatan itu dipegang satu orang ya secara politis. Jadi interesting ya. Kita biasa pikir oke, karena sains maka ateis. Padahal sesederhana nggak ada kekuatan political figure yang terlalu besar yang otoritarian. Okay, Prof. Oppy, I think it's interesting because oftentimes we usually commonsensically science is the cause of the rise of atheism, but actually there are many factors. At least, yeah, there are political factors and some moral corruption in the church itself, and maybe science is one of it. But it's not the only cause of the rise of atheism, that's right.
Right. So there are, I mean, I didn't mention other things. One other thing that is probably quite important is the sort of escape from feudalism, where all of the money was sort of tied up with the nobility and wasn't being spent. And so you had a kind of non-functioning economy. And then there was an opening up, at least, of markets in Britain, Northern Europe and North America when they got there. That meant that the standard of living of most people rose quite a bit. And that might have been another factor that if, I mean, this is related to speculations about what the kind of the main functions of religion are. But when life is going well for lots of people, there's at least a tendency to think that when life's going well for lots of people, that kind of impulse to religion will be reduced. And so that's another part of the story that indirectly in some ways will be connected to science because, for example, the kind of improvements in medical science is one of the things that's led to life going better for lots of people, but it's only a very indirect connection.
Okay. Could I say you don't even need science to be an atheist? Am I? Can I say that? Like, yeah, you don't need science to be an atheist. There are any other options to make you an atheist. I mean, like maybe philosophical argument.
Right. So, Ajita Kesakambali, one of the early Charvakas in the 6th century BC, didn't know much science at all, but the kind of reasons that he had for being an atheist seemed to be quite familiar reasons that atheists would come out with now. So I'm inclined to think that science in the typical case doesn't play much of a role, even if you have lots of people who kind of after the fact say, oh, I accept a scientific worldview and that's why I reject religion, right? I think that that's probably not going to get to the real reasons that lead people to, if they do become atheists, to become atheists.
So please let me translate it. Jadi teman-teman, ini menarik lagi ya. Jadi kasarnya sebenarnya orang nggak perlu sains untuk jadi ateis, gitu loh. Dan ya sains nggak menyebabkan ateisme. Tetapi ya justru itu lebih ekstrim lagi karena bahkan yang namanya argumen filosofis pun dapat menjadikan seorang sebagai ateis. Ya tadi ya di zaman 6 sebelum Masehi mana ada sih yang jadi ateis karena sains, orang-orang India nggak punya sains. Gitu. Jadi at the same time nih atau menyanggah bahwa klaim-klaim orang-orang ya, kamu belajar sains jadi ateis. Enggak begitu. Tapi yang kedua, ini juga klaim yang besar. Berarti nggak harus belajar sains pun jadi ateis. Nah ini interesting nih. Nah sekarang kita akan lanjut ke pertanyaan berikutnya nih ya soal, bisa jadi ateis karena argumen filosofis. Kira-kira apa ya argumen filosofisnya? Let me continue to the next questions, Prof. Oppy. Atheism states there is no God. Do you think atheists have any burden of proof to for the non-existence of God? I mean, like, you need the arguments for the non-existence of God, or you don't need any arguments for the non-existence of God.
So, I think that there's some reason to think that if you're going to be a responsible believer, you have reasons for believing the things that you do. But when it comes to controversial questions, the standard can't be that you have to have reasons that are going to persuade everybody else to agree with you. Right? It's obvious that we don't and couldn't hold ourselves to that kind of standard when it comes to questions in philosophy or religion or politics. So, and in particular, that means you don't need arguments. You don't need arguments that are going to persuade other people to agree with you. So I don't think that argument is important at all for reasonable belief. I do think you have to have reasons, and that means that you've got to thought about stuff and have judgments, and you can say something about why you prefer your view to competing views, but you don't have to think, oh, when I tell you these things, you're going to agree with me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll translate it. Jadi teman-teman menarik ya. Jadi saya nanya nih, ateis itu perlu nggak sih? Ada nggak sih burden of proof buat seorang ateis gitu ya? Jadi ateis itu harus membuktikan bahwa Tuhan itu nggak ada. Jadi menariknya Prof. Oppy juga bilang bahwa untuk mempercayai sesuatu itu secara rasional nggak harus selalu perlu argumen tadi ya, kalau tadi saya nggak salah nangkep gitu. Jadi ya ateis mungkin nggak perlu gitu ya untuk membuktikan gitu. So do you think atheists have the burden of proof to prove the existence of God?
No, I think that, like I said before, everybody has the responsibility, if they're going to be a kind of responsible believer, to have reasons for believing what they believe. But there's all kinds of ways of discharging those responsibilities. I mean, just to give you one kind of thought about this, one kind of good reason for believing a claim is that somebody that you trust to be an authority about these matters tells you that it's true. Now, the content of that can be pretty much anything, that God exists or that God doesn't exist. So, for example, if you're a child and your parents tell you that God doesn't exist or that God does exist, you've probably got pretty good reasons to believe what your parents are telling you just because they're telling you. And so you can end up with at some point, if you're going to maintain those beliefs once you kind of move out of the family home, it'll have to be that there are other reasons that you've sort of acquired to help support the belief. Otherwise, you might change your mind about it. But there's all kinds of ways that you can come to belief that are obviously justified. And people forget about how important the role of testimony from people that you trust is in the formation of your beliefs. So there's no special burden that attaches to coming to believe in God or coming to not believe in God. There are different pathways that can get you there without any violation of reason.
I see. Okay, so I could imply from that it so it doesn't. People always say that atheist is more rational than the theist. Like, yeah, they have maybe science arguments, etc. Yeah. So I could say that it's not always like that. It may be possible that even an atheist could be not more reasonable than the theist. I mean, like a theist even could considered as a rational person.
So I think if you think about theists as a group, imagine there's this group spread all over the world, the theists, and there's another group spread all over the world, the atheists. And then you look at the distribution of rationality amongst those people. And you even look at the distribution of rationality when it comes to their defining belief, the rationality of their belief that God exists or the rationality of their belief that God exists. You'll find a complete spread. There will be people who are irrational and their religious beliefs are irrational, and there'll be people who are rational and their religious beliefs are rational. And it will be the same kind of distribution for the atheists and the theists, right? So there's nothing, it's not like being a theist or being an atheist marks you out as being more rational than someone on the other side. That's just completely the wrong way to think about this.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's an important I think. I'll translate it. Jadi teman-teman, kita kan sering mikir ya, kalau orang ateis itu lebih rasional daripada orang teis. Tapi tadi ya statementnya Prof. Oppy, nggak gitu, nggak gitu mikirnya. Kalau misalnya kita mau bikin ya, seandainya ada dua kelompok ateis sama kelompok teis, itu akan variatif gitu ya. Orang-orang yang rasional, gitu, orang-orang yang tidak rasional. Gitu. Jadi kita nggak boleh mikir bahwa ateis artinya lebih rasional daripada orang teis. Sangat mungkin teis juga rasional dan sangat mungkin teis memang irasional gitu kepercayaannya. Jadi ini apa ya, klaim yang perlu kita tantang gitu bahwa ateis itu lebih rasional karena bahkan Prof. Oppy seorang ateis itu percaya hal tersebut. Oke, kita lanjut ke pertanyaan selanjutnya. Kira-kira ada nggak sih argumen yang kuat bagi ateisme? So Prof. Oppy, I'll continue to your next questions. I really I want to know what do you think the strongest argument for atheism?
Okay, so as you said before, I've written a book called The Best Argument Against God. So you can probably imagine that I'll make a plug for my book at this point. So, but in that book, I don't really give an argument. The title of the book is slightly misleading. It was chosen by the publishers. It wasn't my preferred title. And the way that so here's how I justify my naturalistic beliefs, which entail atheism, to myself. I compare kind of the best version of naturalism that I can come up with various best versions of theism. And I think, okay, which one's the better view? And there are two things that matter. One thing is which one does best at minimizing theoretical commitments. So postulates less things, less complicated properties, less complicated laws, and so on. And the other thing is which one explains more, which explains more of all the stuff that needs to be explained. So who's got the better worldview, the naturalist or the theist? And it seems to me that the naturalist worldview is simpler, and I argue that at length. And it also seems to me that there's nothing that theists can explain that naturalists can't explain just as well. So it seems to me naturalism is better. But that's a complicated judgment. It relied on lots and lots of points. And I'm quite prepared to allow that other people could do the assessment differently. And they might think, using a very similar style of reasoning, that theism was the better view. And I don't mind that, right? I've at length in my book, I explain why I'm a naturalist, and I'm happy with that justification, even though I don't think it has to persuade everybody else. And I'm comfortable with the idea that other people might do the assessment differently. But that's the only kind of argument, or one that takes into account all of the data and tries to weigh the two positions against one another. That's the only kind of argument that I'm interested in. I don't think that you can show that, say, naturalism or theism is logically inconsistent, which is what lots of arguments try to do. And I don't think there's anything interesting about saying, let's consider this little bit of all of the relevant data and see which view does better on this little bit of the data, because who cares? What matters is how they do on all the data. I'm sorry, it's a bit complicated, that thought, but I can't simplify it anymore, I don't think.
Yeah, I get. Yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, if I'm not wrong to listen, you said that there are some things that can be explained by naturalistic worldview that couldn't be explained by that theistic worldview. Am I right?
No, I just said that.
Oh,
I said it the other way around. That
ah,
there's nothing that the theistic worldview can explain that the naturalistic worldview can't explain just as well. I didn't say that there were things that the
okay.
theistic worldview can't explain that the naturalistic worldview can. That's not part of my view.
Okay. Let me translate to the audiences. Jadi menarik banget ya. Kan tadi saya nanya, ada nggak sih argumen yang buat Prof. Oppy itu sangat meyakinkan gitu ya, sehingga buat dia pindah ke ateis. Dia bilang bahwa enggak ya, sebenarnya jawabannya itu adalah karena pandang dunia naturalisme atau anggapan bahwa yang ada di dunia ini hanya natural, itu lebih sederhana dan lebih masuk akal dibandingkan yang supernaturalistik atau yang theistik gitu ya. Jadi nggak perlu bermacam-macam argumen gitu ya, yang justru lebih kecil-kecil. Nah, ini lebih mendingan pakai yang lebih besar, yaitu pandang dunia daripada naturalistik. Prof. Oppy, so the naturalistic worldview is more simpler than the theistic worldview. Could you clarify what do you mean by simpler?
Okay, so maybe the easiest way to think about it is like this. On the naturalistic worldview, the natural reality is all of causal reality. So think of our universe as being the whole of natural reality. That may not be exactly right, but let's pretend that that's right. Then the naturalist says there's the natural world with all this stuff in it, obeying laws, obeying physical laws and chemical laws and biological laws and so on. And there's this evolution of the universe over time. And the theist, at least a kind of standard theist, agrees that you've got all of that stuff, but they add something extra. There's a God who caused natural reality. And that makes their view more complicated because they've got an extra thing and an extra relation. There's a kind of causation that doesn't work the same way that causation within the universe works, where it's a kind of transfer of conserved physical quantities. So there's these extra complexities in the theistic view that are absent from the naturalistic view. So that's what makes the naturalistic worldview simpler, according to me. Right, that's a slight oversimplification of the full story, but it's near enough.
Oke, jadi teman-teman ya, kata Prof. Oppy, kenapa pandang dunia naturalistik atau bahwa segala sesuatu itu cuma alam, itu lebih baik dibandingkan supranatural. Karena ya lebih sederhana gitu ya. kalau misalnya kita punya cara pandang teistik, kita menganggap bahwa oke, memang ada yang natural nih, tapi ada bonus ya. Ada bonusnya adalah ada Tuhan nih, ada entitas lainnya yang tidak berupa yang natural, yang menambah kompleksitas daripada pendapat kita mengenai yang namanya alam semesta gitu. Jadi ya itu bikin lebih ribet gitu ya, kalau teman-teman tahu apa namanya, apa sih namanya ya, aku jadi lupa ya, ya apa namanya, pisau cukur Occam gitu ya. Nah itu mungkin semacam itu ya, lebih pilih yang lebih sederhana dibandingkan yang lebih ribet gitu. Uh, Prof. Oppy, it reminded me of Occam razor. Occam razor. Is that one of the things that you think showing that atheistic, naturalistic worldview is more reasonable than the theistic one? Are there any, are there, is Occam razor something that you think important for think about this?
So sort of yes and no. It's not just that there's a principle that says that you should try to minimize your theoretical commitment, so you try to shave away objects if you possibly can. It's rather that there's a principle that says you have to strike the best balance between trying to minimize your commitments and maximize explanation, so that as much as possible gets explained as well as possible. And there's a trade-off between those two things. Sometimes the way that Occam's razor is stated, it's stated as a principle that just says you should try to minimize your commitments, or that all else being equal, you should try to minimize your commitments. But neither of those ways of saying it gets it exactly right, because it's important that when you're making a theory, what you want to do is explain as much as possible. And postulating more stuff will help you to explain more, but postulating more stuff is a minus, right? And it's a balance between the two, trying to minimize how much you postulate and explaining as much as possible. That's the target. So when I gave my illustration before, that was an argument that naturalism is a little bit simpler than theism. It certainly wasn't an argument that naturalism is better than theism, because we said nothing there about accounting for all the data. And all of the work in sort of justifying my position is trying to argue that there's nowhere where theism gets some advantage in terms of what it can explain. Right, so.
Okay, I'll translate it. Jadi tadi kan saya nanya ya, ini ada hubungan sama Occam razor gak sih, atau pisau cukur Occam gitu ya. Coba untuk jelasin suatu teori itu harus sesederhana mungkin. Iya dan enggak katanya Prof. Oppy. Karena iya karena ya memang segala sesuatu harus sederhana, tetapi pada saat yang bersamaan suatu teori atau pandang diri itu harus bisa menjelaskan sebanyak mungkin kemungkinan gitu. Jadi ya Occam razor penting, tapi enggak gitu juga. Dan tadi Prof. Oppy lanjutin bahwa pandangannya bahwa ya pandang dunia naturalistik itu lebih masuk akal, itu bukan argumen-argumen banget ya, tapi ini cuma mau nunjukin bahwa teisme itu tidak punya kelebihan atau advantages dibandingkan pandang dunia naturalistik ya, bahwa segala sesuatu itu adalah yang alamiah gitu. Oke, kita lanjut dua pertanyaan lagi, nanti saya akan ambil dari teman-teman. Oke, you don't talk too much about arguments, but I really curious. Do you think are there any arguments for theism? Any strong arguments for theism? And if there's any, what do you think is the most strong or the most convincing one? But yeah, what do you think?
Okay, so a long time ago now, back in 2005 or 6, I published a book called Arguing About Gods, and the thesis of the book was that there's no good arguments for or against the existence of God. So I haven't changed my mind about that. So the short answer is no, there aren't any good arguments, right? There aren't any good arguments for, but there aren't any good arguments against either. Now, lots of people think that I set the standards for success for arguments too high, because what I mean is there's no arguments that ought to persuade people who are on the other side to change sides. Right? That's what I mean by a successful argument. And I don't think there are any arguments that live up to that standard. There are more or less arguments that are more interesting and less interesting. Some of the arguments, and when you're presented with them initially, it's quite hard to see how either to respond to them or how someone on the other side would respond to them in a convincing way. The thing that helps the most, I think, is if you've got an argument and you're not sure, like suppose you've got an argument for your position, to find out whether it's good or not, what you should do is go and present it to a bunch of people on the other side and see what they say. Typically, in fact, in almost every case, so long as you haven't messed up on the logic of your argument, they'll say, I don't believe this premise, or I don't believe that premise, or I don't believe this premise. And that means they're just not, the argument's got no force against them, right? And that just happens on both sides. So I guess by the time I wrote that book, I'd been thinking about the arguments for about 15 years, and I'd written papers on lots of the individual arguments already. And so partly it was a kind of inductive argument just from my experience of the arguments. But there's kind of other reasons that should make this seem really plausible to you. If there was an argument out there that was a good argument, should have persuaded everybody to be on one side, it's kind of a mystery why philosophers who teach philosophy of religion go on disagreeing about whether God exists or not. Because if there was a good argument, as parallel proof in mathematics, everyone would just accept the conclusion. So there's a kind of easy arguments to the conclusion that there are no good arguments out there, I reckon. But that wasn't how I got to that view in the first place. I got to it by looking at lots and lots and lots of arguments and thinking about what people on the other side would say about those arguments. And that was how I eventually got around to writing that book.
It's a really interesting position, I think. I'll translate it again. Jadi ini menarik banget ya teman-teman. Kan tadi saya nanya, ada nggak ya argumen yang kuat buat teisme? Nah, Prof. Oppy pernah nulis tahun 2005 atau 2006 mengenai arguments about God ya, buku judulnya Arguments About God, bisa dicari. Nah, di dalam buku tersebut, Prof. Oppy nunjukin bahwa sebenarnya nggak ada argumen yang mengenai ketidakberadaan Tuhan ataupun keadaan Tuhan yang baik ya. Semuanya itu nggak cocok atau nggak bisa membuat seseorang membuat seorang tuh pindah dari teis ke ateis atau ateis ke teis gitu ya. Jadi interesting banget ya posisinya ini. Dan oleh karena itu, ketika saya nanya, ada nggak ya argumen yang kuat buat kebenaran Tuhan? Ya nggak ada. Ya. Demikian juga sebaliknya. Jadi ini posisi yang sangat menarik saya rasa ya. Gitu. Jadi itu posisinya beliau gitu ya. Nggak ada argumen yang kuat untuk keberadaan Tuhan itu sendiri. Oke, maybe I'll ask the last questions, Prof. Oppy, but I'll take some questions from the audiences. So, last questions. What do you think about the future of atheism? Will there be any demise of the religion one day, like when everyone is atheist?
So I have a book called, which you mentioned also, Atheism, the Basics. And in the last chapter of that book, I speculate a little bit about the future. And the kind of main thing that I say is predicting the future of humanity is just a silly thing to get involved with. And we're hopeless at predicting our future more than a few days ahead. Right. I mean, if you think about the shocks that have happened in the last 15 years, the global financial crisis and the coronavirus and so on, and the dramatic effects that those things have had on societies around the planet, you realize that it's very hard to predict the long-term future of humanity. And especially if you think that maybe the fortunes of atheism are tied to kind of material well-being, so that if things get really bad, probably the percentage of people who are atheists will go down, then it's very hard to predict. There are doomsdayers who think that we won't last another century, right? And that there are all kinds of people who think that things are going to get a lot worse. If they do, maybe there won't be many atheists, or maybe that assumption that there's a connection between sort of prosperity and atheism will prove to be wrong, and maybe nonetheless they'll go on being more and more atheists. I just think that the question is unanswerable. The only sensible thing to say is who knows, right? That's my view anyway.
Oke, ya. Oke, thank you. I'll translate. Jadi tadi saya nanya, ada nggak sih waktu di mana mungkin one day gitu ya, agama hilang gitu ya, semua orang jadi ateis gitu ya. Tapi kata Prof. Oppy itu agak agak keburu-buru ya, agak tergesa-gesa kalau kita ngomong ya nggak bisa tuh one day ateis jadi di seluruh dunia gitu. Karena sulit untuk memprediksikan yang namanya masa depan daripada humanity. Ya mungkin ada juga saat-saat di mana pernyataan bahwa prosperity menyebabkan ateisme itu salah ya, tapi justru sebaliknya. Jadi ya sulit lah untuk mengatakan hal itu. Dan kalau kita ngomong akan ada saat di mana ateisme itu merajalela, agak terburu-buru gitu. Sorry, I have one more question for Oppy. It's about a bit personal, but Anthony Flew, if I'm not wrong, is Anthony Flew was one of the philosophers who have a conversion from atheism to deism. What do you think about it? I mean, like, is it really something that is really something wonderful, or maybe it's just what's wrong with conversion? I mean, it's usual with conversion. What do you think, or what is your response about Anthony Flew conversion to atheism to deism?
So I think it's very hard to know what happened with Tony Flew. That is, it's not clear that he ever did have a conversion or convert. But let's suppose, instead of making it about a real life person, just let's imagine somebody who converts. Is there something wrong with that? Not necessarily. It depends on the reasons why they did it. There's so long, and were they irrational? Well, not if they can tell a story that makes their conversion rational. And it doesn't matter which way you go, right? People who convert from theism to atheism, of whom there have been many famous examples, or going the other way. So I don't think that there's anything particularly problematic. And I think given the views that I've got about the way that it can be reasonable for someone to be a theist or to be an atheist, it would be kind of odd if I thought that conversions could only be reasonable in one direction and not the other. That can never be reasonable, so I'm happy to allow that it could be reasonable in either direction.
Yeah. Could I say that Flew conversion is a bit exaggerated? Like, yeah, everyone talks about Anthony Flew conversion, but like, yeah, it's really normal to have a conversion.
So I think that conversions are quite common. And after all, there's a sense in which I underwent one. I was a Christian when I was 12, and by the time I was 14, I wasn't, right? So, and that kind of story is very common, at least in my generation and the generation after me in Australia.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Oppy. Yeah, because I mean, like in Indonesia, there's Indonesia is a really religious country. Everyone is someone who is religious. So when there's maybe a conversion from some famous celebrities, it will be something that will be talked everywhere and everyone. Yeah, I want to show that conversion is something that is normal. Yeah, maybe that's the reason I'm asking these questions.
Well, I think it's very common, and I would prefer that people were accepting of conversions, but many there, I mean, if you think about conversion, apostasy is a kind of conversion, a conversion away, right? And traditionally, in Christianity, the punishment was death, and it is in many other religions as well. So I would prefer that not to be the case.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Oppy. I'll take some questions from the audiences. Okay. Okay, I'll take some questions. As you maybe know, questions from Rianto. In Indonesia, most people put religion as the foundation of morality. In effect, they think that an atheist will be far from morality. While I understand that the foundation of such should be humanity. What do you think about it?
So, sorry, what was the last bit about humility?
Humanity, sorry.
Yeah. So, what was the last sentence?
While I understand that the foundation of such thing should be humanity, what do you think
humanity, about it? Right. So, it's an interesting question where morality comes from and about the relationship, the sort of historical relationship between morality and religion. I think that morality has much deeper roots than religion in humanity. It's interesting that you can see in other primates, you can see a kind of primitive kind of morality, but you don't really see anything that looks like religion. It's also the case that in newborn babies, you see a kind of primitive kind of morality, but you don't see anything that looks like religion. So just on those grounds, I think it's not very plausible that religion is the foundation of morality. Morality has much deeper and kind of, I think, quite non-religious roots. It's also the case, I mean, to make a second point, that if you go back and you look at philosophy, right, philosophy is older than Christianity by a lot. It's older than Islam by a lot. And you find discussions of morality amongst philosophers in ancient India, ancient China, and in the ancient Mediterranean, long before the monotheistic religions are in the frame. So it would be completely astonishing if it turned out that those religions were the foundations of morality, right? There's, backwards causation in time or something, right? It's just not credible.
Okay, I'll translate it. Ya, jadi pertanyaannya kan, agama tuh bisa nggak ya jadi fondasi moralitas? Ya dan enggak. Maksudnya, kalau kita coba untuk tarik ke beberapa ribu tahun lalu, filsafat bahkan ribuan tahun lebih dahulu daripada agama Kristen itu sendiri atau agama-agama monoteistik lainnya. Jadi untuk mengatakan bahwa agama sama dengan moralitas itu satu hal yang dalam dibandingkan sekedar menekutip agama. Tapi ada hal-hal yang bisa berkaitan juga sama moralitas. Ya, bahkan primata, simpanse, bonobo, atau hewan-hewan lainnya itu juga punya sense of morality meskipun tipis. Mungkin bisa baca bukunya Frank de Waal, gitu ya, diterbitin juga sama PT Canisius. Okay. Thank you, Prof. Oppy. I think it's a interest supernatural occurrences such as possession or exorcism. Does the belief negates all supernatural entities or just a one true God and answer through science? Or is there any certain degree, is there a certain degree of belief towards the supernatural? Yeah, I mean, how do you explain some supernatural experiences maybe, or events like possession or exorcism? Does it negate your naturalistic worldview?
So this is going to be quite complicated, because what I would want to do is to take a particular case and then have it properly investigated and then see what kind of explanation, if any, of a naturalistic kind could be given, and to think about, okay, given the data that we've got, should we expect that there's going to be an explanation, or should we think that this is just one of the many, many things that happens in the world that we don't have explanations for? Right? I mean, in principle, there might be explanations, but in practice, there's all kinds of stuff that happens that's just coincidence, or that's a product of prior circumstances that we don't know enough about, so we can't explain the thing that happens. So that would be the first thing, that if we shouldn't expect that we're going to have explanations, satisfying explanations of everything that we observe, because we just don't know enough about the prior conditions. The second thing, though, this is something that Hume worried about a lot in his famous essay on miracles, is about the credentials of the reports that we get. So it's one thing if you think you've experienced one of these things yourself. It's a quite different matter if you get reports of it. And where people have got interest in making these reports and believing in them and so on, you want to know a lot about the credibility of the testifiers before you put much credence in what they say. So that's the kind of second thing. The third thing, the most interesting case, is where you think that you're witness to something magical or supernatural or whatever. And there, a little bit of epistemic humility helps. We all know that it's very easy to be fooled by con men and tricksters and fraudsters and shysters of one kind or another. So again, you'd want to make sure that you've done some very careful investigating of the person or people that you're dealing with, but also of the setup. And I've seen magic shows in which I've got no idea how the magicians do their tricks, but I don't believe that it's magic, right? And so there are going to be similar considerations that may apply in other cases as well. None of that's to say that you might be silly if you, or, irrational if you believe that you'd actually witnessed a miracle. I'm not saying that, but I'm explaining why at least somebody like me or like David Hume would not be inclined to believe reports that they were given.
Okay, yeah, it's really clear. I'll translate it to the audience. Jadi kata Prof. Oppy ada dua alasan ya. Yang pertama, kita nggak tahu nih kondisi prior atau kondisi sebelumnya daripada orang. Let's say ada yang mengalami exorcism atau possession. Jadi kita perlu mempertanyakan banyak hal lah soal kasus tersebut. Dan ya perlu diakui memang semua hal nggak bisa dijelaskan secara menyeluruh. Tapi anyway, ya itu yang terjadi. Oleh karena itu kita perlu penjelasan kedua. Penjelasan yang keduanya adalah bahwa menurut David Hume adalah hal yang berbeda kalau kita pertama mengalami dan mendapatkan laporan. Kalau kita cuma mendapatkan laporan, nah ini kita bisa pertanyakan gitu ya, belum tentu itu terjadi gitu ya. Kita perlu mempertanyakan orang tersebut yang katanya mengalami hal tersebut atau melihat, atau kedua kalian jadi witness-nya atau jadi saksi matanya. Nah itu juga problematis. Kita harus melihat apakah orang ini, kita perlu epistemic humility katanya ya. Kita mungkin kan mudah banget untuk dibohongi gitu sama orang lain. Nah, oleh karena itu ya kita sekali lagi perlu kritis. Ini orangnya kayak gimana sih, biasanya seperti apa gitu. Tapi anyway, intinya soal eksorsisme dan possession ini nggak serta-merta menghancurkan worldview daripada Prof. Oppy mengenai naturalism. Okay, can I pick another questions from the audiences?
Yeah, sure.
Maybe 2 or 3 questions again. This is an interesting question. What is the point of view of atheism to consciousness and the soul?
Okay, so let me treat that as 2 separate questions. So on the question about are we conscious, the answer is just when we're awake, yes. So, and atheists should say that just as much as anybody else. So I don't think that there's going to be any conflict between being an atheist and supposing that some of us some of the time are conscious. On the question about the soul, it depends what you mean. If you mean is a human being a composite of two things, a material body and an immaterial soul, atheists could believe that if that was the best story to tell about the nature of human beings, but I don't think that it is. And so my own view, I'm not a substance dualist of that kind. In fact, I'm an identity theorist, so I think that our mental states are just states of our brain. But that there's a long story to be told there and lots of philosophical arguments to be had. The kind of important thing, I guess, that I'll end with is on this point is just that there are atheists who are substance dualists. If substance dualism is a viable view, then as far as the complexity of theism and atheism go, it's a draw. They're both committed to it.
Oke, sulit. Jadi ya bahkan ada loh ateis yang tadi kan nanya ya, gimana kita mikir soal kesadaran manusia dan jiwa. Kata Prof. Oppy ya, bahkan seorang ateis ada yang dualis substansial gitu ya. Jadi orang nggak harus jadi ateis karena dia percaya akan keberadaan jiwa gitu loh. Dan buat Prof. Oppy memang yang namanya dualisme substansial itu nggak eksplanatif gitu ya. Mungkin Prof. Oppy lebih ke eliminativism gitu ya. Dan pada akhirnya ya itu nggak jadi masalah buat buat seorang naturalistik atau buat seorang ateis gitu loh. Jadi pertanyaan tadi ya nggak jadi masalah gitu ya buat Prof. Oppy gitu. Okay, I'll ask one more question from the audiences, Prof. Oppy. How can an atheist...
Okay, so one of the questions has come up. I can see it on the on a person's screen.
Yeah,
Is that how you're reading them? If I look carefully enough, I can see some of the questions before they appear. Okay. Anyway, go ahead. Ask the next question.
Yeah. Oh, it's okay. Let me explain it. Actually, 3 questions from the same person. Mm-hmm. Okay. Wait. Do you think that theism is harmful to science development? Like the case of theism, speaking again, CRISPR technology, CRISPR technology in genetic modifications, arguing that said technology is just human playing God. Second question, do you think that theism is necessary to provide basic laws, maybe natural laws, in order for human to, it's law and morality in order for human to build a society in the first age of humankind? And the third, if you are able to do it, would you abolish theism or the concept of religion in the society right now? What is the benefits and harm that can be caused by abolishing religion? Yeah, maybe 3 last questions.
Okay, so the first question was about whether religion holds back science in a kind of harmful way. I don't think that there's any necessary conflict between religion and science when it comes to new technology. It's going to depend on the details of the religion, and perhaps on which particular science we're thinking about as well. So, I mean, to take the example about CRISPR, there's nothing in the Old Testament or the New Testament or the Quran that says thou shalt not indulge in research on CRISPR, right? So you've got to do a lot of work, right, of a kind that's going to be very controversial to establish that there's some religious prohibition on that research. So that will be my answer to the first question. Okay, I've forgotten what the second question was, so just remind me.
Second question. Do you think that theism is necessary to provide basic laws and morality in order for humans to build a society in the first place?
So I think the answer to that is No, I kind of talked about that already when I said that morality is much older than religion. I favour a kind of evolutionary account of the development of humanity over a very, very long period of time. And morality is something that has a very long, the development of morality has a very long history. And the kind of early morality was refined in various ways over time. And you might think that there are particular little bits of morality that owe a lot to particular religions. And to kind of argue about that, we'd have to go back and look at what the ancient Indians, ancient Chinese, ancient people around the Mediterranean and so on had to say about ethics, and independently of what they said about religion. Okay, now the third question.
Yeah, should you abolish religion?
Should we abolish religion?
Yeah, what is the benefit?
Okay, so there's several things in this. One, it's not within our power to do it, right? Because people will go on being religious if they want to be. So it's not like there's a wand you could wave. The second thing is that kind of abolition never works, right? If you really didn't like religion, just about the worst thing you could do would be to make it illegal, because eventually there would be a big resurgence in religion. If we could abolish religion, it was within our power and we could do it, would we want to do it? Well, I don't see why. It's not as if religious beliefs are necessarily the worst beliefs that people have. There's all kinds of, to take one kind of example, there's all kinds of extreme political beliefs which aren't necessarily tied to religion that can be really terrible. To take a different example, there's all kinds of superstitions and kind of irrational biases that people are subject to that have very bad consequences for people's lives. Why not think about abolishing those rather than religion?
Okay, yeah, it's really clear. I'll translate it. Jadi 3 jawaban ya. Enggak, yang pertama, apakah sains itu, agama itu mengganggu perkembangan sains? Agak cukup problematis. Kenapa? Karena tadi Prof. Oppy ngomong ya, di Alkitab atau di kitab manapun tuh nggak ada ya larangan untuk janganlah lakukan CRISPR gitu. Jadi nggak boleh gitu, nggak ada. Gitu. Jadi untuk bilang agama itu bikin kamu nggak bisa berkembang secara saintifik, terlalu terburu-buru. Yang kedua tadi ya, apakah perlu apa ya tadi ya? Law and morality perlu nggak sih untuk agama perlu nggak sih untuk bangun hukum dan juga moralitas? Nggak perlu. Tadi Prof. Oppy udah ngomong. Moralitas itu jauh lebih dulu daripada agama, terutama agama-agama monoteistik gitu loh. Oke, jadi sekali lagi singkirkan asumsi kalian bahwa yang namanya orang ateis kadang-kadang tidak bermoral, ya itu salah besar. Gitu. Ketiga, perlu nggak kita menyingkirkan agama? Enggak ya, jangan sampai kita mikir salah satu hal yang paling buruk yang bisa kamu lakukan kalau kamu nggak suka agama adalah untuk membuatnya menjadi ilegal. Gitu tadi kata Prof. Oppy. Itu cukup ekstrem ya, karena ya nggak pernah baik hal-hal semacam itu ya, yang namanya ilegal apa segala macam. So that's the answer, Raihan. Thank you for asking, for your willingness to come here. It's really I really personally enjoy this interview, and I think it is a really important thing to talk in Indonesia, because many Indonesians have so many like negative presuppositions about what is atheism. So I think this talk is important, and especially for the audiences. The dialogue between Indonesia, one of the most religious country in the world. Yeah, so thank you, Prof. Oppy.
So thanks for inviting me. And thanks to everyone who asked questions.
Can you conclude some, maybe in some statements about this interview, like about atheism and so on?
So what do you want me to do? I'm sorry, I'm getting an echo. I don't know whether you can hear it as well. But...
Can you conclude this this interview, maybe in some statements?
So I suppose maybe I'll start with, I'll end with this. The views that I've expressed about atheism are my own. They're not necessarily shared by all of the other atheists, even in my part of the world, never mind all around the world. There's a wide diversity of different kinds of approaches to atheism. And there are certain kinds of atheists who in the past 20 years or so have got lots of attention, who maybe aren't the best models of atheism to look at when you're making up your mind about what you think about atheists. So we with that.
Oke, I'll translate. Jadi perlu ingat ya teman-teman, ini pendapat Prof. Oppy dan pendapat soal ateisme itu sendiri sangat beragam di dalam dunia gitu ya. Jadi jangan anggap ini salah satu representatif saja. Kayaknya saya bisa ngomong ini pandangan yang cukup moderat ya tentang ateisme dan agama gitu ya. Coba bandingin sama ateis-ateis macam siapa deh? Coba sebut. Itu yang kayak, wah itu pokoknya agama itu musuh bagi rasionalitas, agama itu musuh bagi sains. Tapi Prof. Oppy ngomong enggak ya, bahkan ateis maupun teis bisa menjadi rasional. Dan saya rasa ini dialog yang sangat penting untuk kita lakukan antara ateis dan teis ya. Jadi semoga kalian itu hilang ya presupposisi bahwa yang namanya ateis itu sama dengan orang-orang yang musuhnya agama. Yang enggak, tadi Prof. Oppy nunjukin bahwa enggak ya, agama bahkan nggak bisa diabolish atau dilarang gitu. So yeah, it really is a fun interview. Thank you, Prof. Oppy. I really hope there are many opportunities for us to have another interview with you, or hopefully.
That will certainly be possible. My teaching term starts in a couple of weeks, so I'm likely to be busy for the next couple of months, but at some point in the future, it'll be great to come back and do this again.
Okay. Maybe one day I'll contact you again to talk about other things about atheism. Thank you, Prof. Oppy. I think my colleagues, do you want to state other things? Oh, no. Okay, Prof. Oppy, it's really great to have you here. See you another time.
Okay, thanks very much.